Right, hello and welcome to our video. My name is Nancy Doyle and I'm the founder of Genius Within and the co-director of the Centre for Neurodiversity Research Work at Birkbeck University of London. And I'm here with some colleagues who talk to you about being neuro-inclusive by design. So the neurodiversity movement is not new anymore. There's lots been said and spoken about with regards to neurodiversity in business over the last few years, and it's becoming something that more and more people have heard all about. So what I'd like to do in this video is take you through a little bit of that history, explain what we mean by neurodiversity and how that affects us at work, and then talk about how some of the leading projects and leading companies in this field are starting more and more to be neuro-inclusive by design. So here we go with a bit of slide share. She says, hopefully. Okay, so yes, how are we going to be neuro-inclusive by design? Okay, so the history and language of neurominorities. So dating back as early as actually the 18th century, we had the first mention of ADHD. It was then called hyperkinetic syndrome. But more through the 19th and early 20th century, we start to see medical papers, social papers, looking at biological papers around this idea that not all humans think the same way. And initially, this was considered in very pejorative ways. We thought about all of the difficulties associated with different thinking. So dyslexia was known as word blindness and was considered a disability. We had things like hysteria, where we considered the anxiety to be related to a particular strange event with women's bodies. We thought of clumsy child syndrome instead of dyspraxia, and we really started pinpointing where human thinking diverged from the norm. But we only thought about that in terms of the norm being the right way to be. And if you were, if you were average, if you were able to sit in a standard classroom and participate in standard work, that was right. And if there was anything slightly different about you, that was very wrong. In the mid to late 20th century, we started to get a little bit more kind of detailed about how we described differences. We talked about attention hyperactivity and attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder. We talked about the autistic spectrum condition, dyslexia, dyspraxia, anxiety, and things like that. Still very much framed in the negative, but getting a little bit more complex and detailed around where those differences come from. And actually, we started to get more medical and more brain-based about where those differences came from. So initially, things like autism were thought to be related to parenting and mothers not being kind or warm enough to their children. And we very quickly realised that was very wrong, and that actually there are some neurological differences. And so now in the 21st century, we've been able to be quite precise about quite a lot of those neurological differences. We found differences in the endocrine system and neurotransmitters such as dopamine, noradrenaline. We started to realize that these different brains have differences in the way that we process senses. So if you think of a normal level of noise being heard as particularly loud or particularly quiet by a neurodivergent thinker, sensitivity to pain, to temperature, to light. And we can see these differences in neuroimaging. So we know that people are having very different experiences with their senses. And we've also found differences in the connectivity between brain regions. So, for example, autistic and ADHD brains tend to be very, very hyperconnected around emotions and the processing of anxiety and the senses, but less hyperconnected front of the brain where we put things in order and make sense of things. So we've got this kind of notion of biological differences, initially those differences being considered all negative and potentially about the way people were raised or about their character or their morals. And now we realise that actually we've got these different brains and we're starting to wonder, what's the purpose of this? So we've got a group of humans, some of which are average, some of which are not average, and how are they not average? And so we've got this kind of overall kind of umbrella title of neurominority. So if you're a neurominority, it means you have an unusual neurotype, You're one of 15 to 20% of the population as opposed to the average. You might have dyscalculia, dyslexia, ADHD, Tourette syndrome, acquired neurodiversity, which would be differences that you've picked up during your lifetime as a result of health conditions or injury. You might have mental health needs, you might be autistic, you might be dyspraxic. And we're starting to really focus on what those things bring as strengths. So we're starting to realise that dyslexics usually come with visual thinking capacity, with creativity, with 3D mechanical reasoning skills. ADHDers tend to have qualities of hyperfocus and bring energy and passion. Autistic people are very often exceptional at fine detail processing, have brilliant long-term memories. And so we're starting to think, like, well, purposefully, we've got this kind of balance of specialist thinkers and generalist thinkers. So it's not so much there are people who are normal and then there are people who are abnormal. There are people who are generally average, and then there are people who are particularly talented in this thing, but sometimes to the exclusion of other things. So we're in a shift. We're in a shift between neurodiversity being something that we didn't really talk about, and unusual neurotypes being considered kind of broken and in need of fixing. And now we're thinking, actually, no, there's two sides to this coin. However, even though that's what we're thinking, and many workplaces are starting to deliberately try and recruit neurodifferent individuals because of the talents, we've still got quite a big picture of exclusion across the whole of society. Neurominorities are more likely to be out of work, more likely to be in precarious employment, more likely to be struggling to be promoted, to be underqualified, to be misunderstood, be fearful of misunderstandings. Some neurominorities have what I call pre-employment trauma disorder, which is where the consistent experience of being excluded in education or in early careers has left people in this kind of state of trauma. And so little misunderstandings or worries that might seem kind of, like nothing to you, actually generate quite a strong response and quite a fearful response. And this can be confusing for colleagues. Neurominorities are more likely to have difficulty with communication and more likely to have sensory sensitivities that can lead to overwhelm and meltdown. And so we've got this kind of odd picture where potentially being a neurominority can bring strength and talent and purposefulness and diversity to a team, but it also comes with these risks that need taking care of. And so in most developed economies, we have legislation to protect disabled people more broadly, and we include neurominorities within that protection. And so employers have started to get quite proactive about this and thinking, instead of, oh, well, we might have a few people and we'll try and deal with them if they pop up. Actually, how can we really embrace this idea? How can we use neurodiversity, cognitive diversity as part of the way in which we provide a more comprehensive service, because our customers are going to be neurodiverse as well as our staff. And so if we can design for neurodiversity, that gives us a business advantage. That's one of the ideas, and one of the real carrots for being a neuro-inclusive employer. So at Genius Within, we talk about different levels of neuro-inclusiveness. And I think the first level is a sort of basic awareness where you've got peer groups, employee resource groups, you've got champions coming in, you might be doing talks, and you're generally building awareness in your organisation that neurodiversity is a thing, that people who might kind of come across as being slightly unusual aren't necessarily a problem. And actually, this could be a way of getting creative thought into your team. And we start to kind of change and break down some of the stigma, break down some of the stereotypes. The next stage that people go through is looking at reasonable adjustments or reasonable accommodations, starting to really appreciate the value of diversity and being more inclusive. And we find typically that when people are at that stage, there tends to be more disclosure. So all of a sudden, individuals know that it's safe to say, oh, actually, I'm dyslexic, or actually, I'm an ADHD. And so you start to realise that there's more people in this group working for you than you might have thought. And then we've got this final stage, which is what we call universal design, which is where instead of waiting for things to go wrong and then giving people some support, we actually go, well, you know what? We're going to have 15 to 20% of our population with some sort of neuro difference, why don't we design from that from the get-go? Why don't we kind of think to ourselves, these are the sorts of things that are going wrong. We know those go wrong because we've seen them before. How can we prevent them from going wrong so that more people can work at their best more of the time? So that's the plan with neuro-inclusivity, and that's what everybody's aiming for, and people are at different stages of that. So I'm just going to stop sharing for a moment. So I'd like to introduce you to some awesome colleagues of mine who have been part of this Neuro-inclusive by Design mission that we were all on. And they're going to share some of their experience of being part of neuro-inclusivity and what kind of things we might do as employers, as you know, to create that. So it sounds great, doesn't it? Neuro-inclusive by design, wonderful. Yes, let's all do that. Yeah, but how? How do you actually do that? Because you know, we can all go into things with the best of intentions, but we need to know what the mechanics are. So to start, I would like to introduce you to my colleague Uzma. Uzma is a business psychologist and a doctoral student in occupational psychology. And Uzma and I worked together on a project looking at selection and assessment tools. So one of the first barriers a neuro minority might experience is the recruitment, the hiring process. You know, how do you actually get through cognitive tests, interviews, and all of those things? And we know that cognitive tests tend to exclude neurodivergent thinkers. But Uzma and I decided to find out how. So Uzma, can you tell us a bit of background? What are psychometric tests and how are they used in selection?
Sure. Okay, so I just wanted to sort of quickly introduce the project that we were working on, just to give it a bit of context. We were commissioned by a recruitment consultancy who were developing a new recruitment tool internally, not just for themselves, but also for the corporate customers. And the idea was that it will be used to review the initial design. So that was our brief, to review the initial design of this psychometric, which was aiming to profile high potential candidates. And what we brought to the project was our sort of background in psychometrics. And in answer to your question, a psychometric test specifically used in selection is a profiling tool for people to assess a range of different attributes and qualities like intelligence, skills, and personality. And in principle, it was first introduced into the recruitment process as a way to objectively and scientifically gather insight into a candidate's suitability for a role that otherwise would be difficult to pick up in your box standard job interview.
So they're supposed to predict who's going to be good at this job and who isn't. So, and they're supposed to be objective.
In principle.
In principle. So Uzma, what are the criticisms of psychometric tests with regards to neurodivergence?
So there have been a few criticisms that have been picked up along the way. They have been around since the 1950s, if not earlier. And as well as them, you know, having some very good advantages, I would say the major criticisms are that often these assessments don't account, say, for environmental factors that may have an effect on someone's ability to achieve their full potential. They also have raised questions in terms of the bias that is built into this test and potentially discriminating during hiring decisions. So, for example, during a test design stage, the test designer could potentially be looking at a very limited sample group unknowingly, which is used and doesn't account for a more representative demographic of people. What that means is that the test isn't always as generalized as you would like it to be.
Yes, and so when we were working with this organisation, they particularly wanted us to identify the experience of neurodivergent applicants going through this test. So would you like to explain what we found? Because I thought it was super interesting. I love this project.
Yeah, I mean, as well as finding things that we thought we were going to be, you know, potentially identify and unravel, we did find a whole host of other things as well, thanks to the cohort that we worked with on a very participatory level. So having reviewed this particular psychometric assessment and a few others with an actual neurodiverse talent group, so it was, fully representative. We found several pain points in the design and the accessibility of that assessment. So it was noted that the language that was used was potentially ambiguous, it was confusing, and it was inaccurate. This is the feedback that I received. And also the language used to construct these items or test questions. It was very, very unclear in the sense that, for example, they used double-barreled questions. That time away from the assessment if it was under time pressure. So, what is the question potentially trying to ask? It was deciphering a unnecessarily complicated way of writing a question, using very vague terms, and also culturally inappropriate references. So in essence, it was a design flaw in the detailed nuances that were used, which didn't help with those social communication differences that a lot of people generally experienced on a more general level.
And I remember everyone in the focus group that we worked with, dyslexic people, ADHD, autistic, dyspraxic, we had quite a wide range of people in the group. But no matter what their neurotype brand, they all had that same experience of these questions are vague, we don't know what they're getting at. We think it could be this, but maybe it's a trick question. So neurodivergent thinkers were overthinking. And sometimes the question was, it was the question that was flawed, not the thinking. But the neurodivergent thinkers were questioning themselves and going, it must be me, it can't be that obvious, or clearly a mistake, what am I missing? And so people got into a kind of stress and worry response, even though actually it was the question that had the problem. And I remember a neurotypical person commenting at the time, oh, just pick the best answer and move on. And I thought it was really funny because that's, of course, what none of us neurodivergent thinkers could do. We couldn't pick the best answer and move on. We got stuck second guessing ourselves and worrying about it. And what I thought was even funnier about that is that that's actually predictive of how we are in the workplace. So when we come to one of the things that we bring to the workplace is this kind of ability to fine tune and work out where the ambiguities are and where something could be clearer or not clearer. And we get stressed about it and we ruminate on it until it's done. And so if you work with that, what you'll get is a better tool. But if that's irritating to you, what you might get is conflict. So thinking about those sort of deep embedded barriers in selection processes, Uzma, and they're probably, that's just in questionnaires and surveys that you would use, but for psychometric purposes. But those sorts of things will also be in, application forms, in instructions for interviews. There'll be all kinds of ambiguities and kind of biased directive thinking going into selection. What do you think employers should do to be more neuro-inclusive by design?
If we were specifically focusing on psychometrics in terms of profiling prospective candidates, I would say that from experience, we know that too many recruiters actually use these psychometrics in the pre-screening stage. Yes, they would use them at other points of the selection process, but majority do use it at the pre-screening stage, and that inadvertently will filter out and miss good talent. Like the neurodifferent thinkers, for instance. And I suppose it would be a case of reconsidering the emphasis that is actually put on psychometrics. How much of it are you, how much importance are you giving this in terms of filtering out during that pre-screening stage or any stage during those recruitment decisions, and at which point they are being used for that purpose, rather than just going for that. It's not foolproof, just saying, okay, we're going to use this at the pre-screening stage because that's what everybody else does.
So be a bit more thoughtful about what you're doing.
Being a bit more thoughtful.
Questions, test them out, see what kind of different responses you get, and think about the weighting that they have compared to other forms of recruitment, like work sample testing, for example. Because something else we know from management science is that interviews are a fairly limited way of recruiting people and don't tend to predict very well how people will perform, whereas things like work sample tests can be really successful if they're designed well. Thank you, Uzma. So moving over to my lovely colleague George Wong, who is a chartered psychologist, an occupational psychology specialist. So George, thinking more broadly than psychometric testing, how can a company review its whole approach to recruiting if they want to be neuro-inclusive by design?
Yeah, thanks, Nancy. So, well, I think that employers should consider reviewing sort of the whole framework of a recruitment process. So, and to drill down into whether or not it's likely to disadvantage neurominorities and other disabled applicants. So, a bit like the tool that Uzma was just talking about, and also you talked about interviews and things. So, but I'm thinking sort of from the start to finish, if you like an end-to-end sort of process. So just as an example, are the key requirements of the job role specific enough? Are they communicated in a way that a wide audience would understand? So you talked about the clarity of the questions. You know, it's this also translates into how we communicate what the job requires, what the demands are, what the outputs are required, you know, what the performance indicators and those kinds of things. So in effect, your kind of job description. And then beyond that, so does the language that you use in job adverts, you know, does that reflect the role requirements as well, without adding sort of spurious qualities or characteristics that maybe aren't even relevant to the job? So, you know, in the past, people will have, I'm sure, you know, many times seen things like, you know, great customer service skills are essential or desirable, you know, for a back office job role where people aren't actually customer facing. So, or, you know, good communication skills when perhaps that isn't, you know, the be all and end all for this particular role. So just considering those sorts of things. And then how does the recruitment process as a whole ensure that neurodivergent applicants feel confident to disclose and request adjustments? So, you know, fair enough, employers don't know that an adjustment's required if people don't disclose, but people should feel confident that if they disclose or if they decide to disclose, that they will be taken seriously and, you know, that adjustments will be made. So in terms of the interview process, like you said, Nancy, they're not very good predictors of future job success, but nevertheless, employers like to use them. They like to meet people and talk to them, see, you know, see the whites of their eyes kind of thing. How do you reduce any risk of unconscious bias? So if an autistic person were being interviewed, how do you ensure that interviewers don't sort of disregard things like, oh, they didn't make eye contact, so they can't be very good at communicating. So these little bits of, you know, adjustments that you have to think about when you're reviewing how inclusive your recruitment processes would be useful.
One of the things I really liked about Uzma's project was how it was actually the panel of the focus group that did the work for us. So, you know, it's not like when you're designing these things, you have to sit there and think to yourself, right, let me second guess what this person might need, this person might need, that person might need. That's what a focus group is for. A well-run focus group can get you some of that information. And then if you want to find out how generalizable that is, you can also always follow it up with a survey, bringing out the points that your focus group have raised and then finding out how common is it, you know, is this a common problem or is this just sort of anecdotal? And so, you know, that if you want to go about this process, you don't have to suddenly gen up and become an expert on having an ADHD brain or an autistic brain. You can just ask people who already have them and those people will help you kind of identify where those barriers are. And just also, George, I really liked what you said about making it safe for people to disclose. The tool I always use for that is kind of saying up front, do you need adjustments for this for recruitment? Here's some we've provided before. Please give us a call if you want to discuss. And when you say here's some we've provided before, it's kind of like a subtle signal to people that you're asking because you want them to tell you so you can help, as opposed to you're asking so you can screen people out. And there's a big difference. You know, lots of people's barriers would go up because they think, oh no, I don't want to say because I'll be thought of differently. But when you put the reasonable adjustment offers in there, people might think you're more genuine. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's probably lots of different ways employers could do that. I mean, in this country, you know, we do have disability confident, for example, used to be called the 2 ticks or whatever. And I mean, that sort of sends a signal that, you know, we encourage and we would like to attract talent from a wide range of disabled applicants. Criteria for being a disability confident employer is that you will guarantee an interview to anybody who meets the minimum requirements. So, you know, you talked, like Uzma said, a very important thing about psychometric tests being used as a screening tool, you know, to save time and money. I recognise that, but to, you know, to basically screen people out of the process. But actually, you're not giving them the opportunity to demonstrate their abilities if you do that too soon. And lots of disabled applicants, as you've noted, lots of neurodivergent applicants in particular, will not have a lot of work experience potentially on their CVs. And so, you know, giving these additional sort of supports and adjustments can make all the difference. You might find somebody who's, you know, an absolute diamond, but you'll never have met them because they've been screened out.
Yeah, so there's a real kind of theme that people are missing out on wildcard entries. So yeah, we have a new employee starting with us who we've actually nicknamed the wild card because he didn't meet any of the criteria, and then when we met him we realized all our criteria was wrong. He was sent over to us as a wild card from the recruitment company. They were like, oh, this doesn't quite meet your brief, but we think you should meet this person. And then we met him and we were like, yeah, you're absolutely right. So he's now known as his name followed by the wild card. But yeah, and then, you know, how do we learn from that each time? So what makes it neuro-inclusive by design is when you have those problems, then instead of going, oh, well, we fixed it for this person, you go, right, how did we make that mistake? What can we do differently next time so that we're not making that mistake over and over again? So, George, I know that you've been involved in a fabulous project with Microsoft UK to build neuro-inclusivity as standard into apprenticeships and internships. Do you want to tell us about that briefly, and then we'll hear more from other people that have been working on that project?
Yeah, sure, absolutely, thank you. Yeah, so it's quite a specific area of business at the moment, and I guess, you know, a bit like you're saying, it's more about developing the experience, the knowledge, and then feeding back, and then growing the systemic changes. So from this particular project, the early and career team at Microsoft, so their role is to recruit, onboard, and support apprentices, interns, and graduates into the business. And they wanted to make the onboarding process for their interns, apprentices, and graduates more neuro-inclusive because they were aware from previous intakes that there might be a high proportion of neurominorities within those cohorts. So they became aware that, you know, conscious that they might need to adjust or widen the ways in which they communicate with them during the onboarding process, but also how people can be supported throughout their time at Microsoft. So the idea then is for any information that's gathered from making those changes to provide a feedback loop to inform any future improvements to that process.
Okay, very cool. So thank you, George. Also working on the Microsoft project has been Angie Alderman. Angie Alderman is an executive coach and organizational development specialist. So Angie, welcome. And Angie's been working much more on the kind of post-recruitment side and thinking about the employees and their journey, their employee lifecycle journey within the business. So when a neurodiverse cohort comes in, Angie, what kind of things do you have to do at onboarding stage to make it neuro-inclusive by design?
Okay, so thank you, Nancy. At the onboarding stage, we basically, when we're in a group coaching setting, we would help them to identify and engage in their individual strengths through the coaching. But the focus very much at the start is around what exactly is neurodiversity. So at Genius Within, we actually have an adjustment screener. So what you've been saying about finding out around adjustments. So in the case of Microsoft, the adjustment screener was done prior to the cohort coming in, which actually triggers their interest and starts people to begin to think about themselves in different ways. If they don't know they're neurodiverse or neurotypical, and those others that do know themselves, know that they're entering into this arena where this is not a taboo subject and it's going to be very much unpacked. So our starting point is essentially what you did with us at the top of the session. So the slides that you shared, we'll be doing a more extensive version of this content just to sort of bring it into the fore. And then through that, we create this awareness in the session about different ways of thinking. And it provides the opportunity to clarify the spectrum of neurodiversity and non-visible disabilities so that we can understand that better in the workplace and understand better what kind of challenges that we may be in front of us. So as well, saying that, you know, people are sort of then becoming aware of discrimination hotspots so that they can think about themselves and how they can work around that and be more inclusive. So the point of doing this is that everybody has the same learning and the same information from the get-go. This is the absolute kind of starting point.
And so a neurotypical person that doesn't have a minority neurotype, they're as much part of this process as people who've self-identified or people who've yet to identify. And so it's more of a kind of, what am I like at work? What are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? Do you find that you need to manage any competing needs between the kind of neurodivergent participant on this process and the neurotypical?
Sometimes it's quite useful that we actually look at, well, first of all, myself and the client, so Microsoft, we really made sure that we had consistency before we began. So we wanted to create consistency. So everything we're doing is so that we're role modeling it in the room, and then the cohorts role modeling it back in business. So really letting people know well in advance, so that we're not making assumptions about the group before we've even started. But in coaching terms, we actually use a clean setup, which is encouraging everybody to think about, if for the session to go just as they would like it, what would it be like? So inviting people to think about, what will you see? What will you hear? For example, what will you feel? This gives the opportunities for people to focus on their individual needs. So we're offsetting that competing piece. And on a practical level, the group are invited to think about others doing things differently. So how are they engaging in the session? Do they want to be present and not engaged? Do they want to be on camera, off camera? Thinking about all the practicalities so that we remove the assumption and we remove this sense of people seeing things from their way. So for example, that person's always off camera, or that person's talking too much, or that person's texting. All of the things are available to everybody. So we're not singling anybody out for being different or wanting something different.
So it's like a clean start where there's no assumptions made and no judgments made about who may or may not be neurodivergent, just kind of setting goals for, you know, how you are at your best, what you'd like to have happen. So a real kind of contracting, individuals contracting with what they're about to do as their work and taking time to explore that. That sounds great. What would you say are the benefits for employees and employers of this approach?
Okay, so for employees, it creates a reflective space for them to think about how they will work at their best, as you've said, and a big focus on well-being, which is you know, it's important. So it gets them to think differently from different perspectives, but around their tasks and goal setting. And at the same time, really inviting them to hone those active listening skills. So they're not thinking, what can I say next? I mean, standard, but just thinking about listening to each other and listening to the different perspectives, which creates that sense of empathy and this sense of unconditional positive regard. So not accepting everything everyone's saying, but listening first before making a judgment call on that. And that helps create that sense of a trusted community. And the cohorts, just to say, are working across the business in different roles in different departments. They're not with each other all the time all together. So the similarity is that they're coming into the business at the same time and going through similar experiences as early careerers. So they can learn from each other and they can begin to lean, and they lean into each other, and they're sharing tips and strategies, which then helps them to navigate as they go back into the business. And then they've got that legacy moving forward. And
wonderful. So a real sense of camaraderie and breaking down barriers between those that have disabling conditions and those that don't. So just everybody treated the same. So for employers, what are the benefits for employers, Angie?
On a macro level, the benefits for employers are it helps support managers because the cohort builds an extensive toolkit to help them manage themselves, their work, and each other better. But on a micro level, I should say, on a macro level, it provides a space to nurture those inclusive behaviours and encourage and support individuals to remain curious, to remain empathetic, and acceptance, you know, that we do think differently, all of which is reputational because these individuals move around the business, they become our future leaders, and they actually go out to other companies. So they're wearing that Microsoft brand, they're building a reputation, and, you know, essentially we're creating that advocacy so that people are becoming much more aware.
So it's almost like blending what we would do in coaching at the individual level to support an individual, what we would do in awareness to support colleagues to be allies, all in one cohort, without the kind of barriers of you are the helped, you are the helpee, which actually also reduces stigma. Yeah, very interesting. So thank you, Angie. And now I'd like to introduce Laajam, who is a cloud solution architect apprentice, which is an awesome job title. And Ahmed is an employee of Microsoft, and I believe started his Microsoft journey before we started doing the neuro-inclusive design onboarding, but actually had some some good support for neurodivergence in the workplace, but at the individual level. Ahmed, do you want to say hi? What's been your experience so far?
Hi. So, yeah, I got introduced to Genius during the summer last year, and so the first thing that we did was to have a workplace needs assessment with Georgina, and following that we set up one-to-one coaching sessions to look at more specifically how we can support or set up a framework to support me at my workplace. And before working with Genius Within, we didn't really have an external partner to help neurodiverse employees. So it was, so I think it's improved quite a lot since working with you guys. So that's been good.
Great. So you had a workplace needs support assessment with Georgina, and then you went on to have some coaching, and that will have helped you develop strategies and recommendations for how you can work at your best more of the time. So what's some examples, Ahmed? What are some things that came out of the coaching process for you personally?
Yeah, so I think what's been good from the coaching session is it's a mix of reflecting on my own disability, which is dyslexia and dyspraxia, and seeing how I can benefit from it and actually acknowledging it more. Because actually, I think a lot of neurodiverse individuals don't really know that much about their own neurodiversity. So actually, I had to be educated on my own neurodiversity and see where what my strengths are and where I can improve, or at least create a strategy to work around my things that are not that strong, areas that are not as strong, you know. And we looked at planning strategies and also setting up a session with my own manager to make him aware of my disability. And I think awareness is also one of those things that are quite important at the workplace. So as I just mentioned, awareness for myself as well, but also to my manager and my colleagues.
So kind of learning more about yourself being quite a cathartic experience. And it's true what you say, you know, when you get a diagnosis, nobody gives you a manual to go with it, do they? You know, like you're right, you have been bestowed with the gift of dyslexia. You now know you will have all these things that you feel well, all these things that you struggle with, off you go. It doesn't work like that all the time. Exactly. And so it's quite important to spend time thinking about that. So how is that working for you now? You know, you had that session with your manager, you've looked at planning strategies as well. You know, how are those strategies working out for you, Ahmed?
So we're about to have that session with my manager coming up in a few weeks. So, but I think following the first session we've had, looking at my own strategy in approaching tasks that I have, I think it's improved. I have a framework that once a week I organize all the tasks that I have and set out time to reflect on myself and that I'm on top of things, and make sure that I break down everything that I need to do, and also or categorizing them into what I have to do and what's urgent, what's not so urgent, and then prioritizing them in that way. I think there will be a bit more work more work that needs to be done on areas of my disability. For example, like how to do like presentations and writing and being more effective on that. But I think what was most important for me was to get a good framework to handle my like day-to-day life, you know.
And so that kind of framework where you've been through some kind of executive coaching processes, looking at how you plan and organize time. So that's the stuff that is now happening since you've been recruited. That's now happening as standard in the onboarding process. What do you think that's you know, can you kind of what do you think about your your colleagues coming in now, having that as standard as part of their onboarding? Do you think that's going to be useful for them? That's quite leading as a question. I guess I think it is, but feel free to tell me I'm wrong.
No, I think that would be really useful. I think that would be good. Yeah, when I started at Microsoft, there wasn't really a lot of frameworks, or that I had to, you know, work myself around things myself. And but it's been good since, you know, since we worked with you, and since awareness has been increased at my workplace. But like having it as part of the onboarding process, I think would be really good. Yeah, and I think you were talking about the application process with employees. I think Microsoft was being really good with that part. Like we didn't really have a psychometric test in as an online form, but everything was in the workplace, and I think it was quite accommodating for someone with dyslexia. Yeah.
Good. So what kind of things did you find accommodating? What specifically?
I think, for example, they did have like curveball questions, but if you're in a workplace and for me at least, it's easier to express myself when I see someone face to face if it's a difficult kind of question, and they allow you to have the time that you need to answer these questions, like technical questions. Yeah, so a bit similar to a psychometric situation, but if you do it face to face, then you can actually express yourself in a different way instead of it just being in a computer screen.
So having that, you know, different ways to express yourself is a great reasonable adjustment. So what I think is interesting about neurodiverse accommodations is that actually what neurotype you are defines what kind of accommodation you might need, really. So, you know, for you, face-to-face works best. For someone who's autistic, possibly written would work better. So, you know, can you kind of flex how you're getting the information so that people can respond in a way that's workplace appropriate? So, you know, in a workplace, you might be remote and you can respond to everything written.
Yeah, or that.
You might be face to face and you can respond to everything face to face, but does it matter for the job?
Yeah, well, this was before COVID times, so we could be going face to face on interviews, but you know, working around things and doing it remotely through video or like a video call would be also good. But
okay, thank you very much for contributing, Ahmed. So last but by no means least, I'd like to introduce Carline Bryan. Carline is the Global Talent Director for Microsoft, and has kind of overseen and sponsored the initiation of these neuro-inclusive by design programs that Microsoft is really leading. So Carline, as a major international employer, Microsoft is pretty famous for being neuro-inclusive now. What do you think is different about being inclusive as standard? You know, what's different about what you're doing now?
Well, I think at the heart of it is really what drives us as a mission at Microsoft, and that's to empower every organisation and person on the planet to achieve more. And I think when you really dig into that to understand what that means, it has to start with our people, our employees, and, you know, creating an environment where everybody can do their best work. And I think that's something that we continue to learn on every day. And I really think the key learning on that is about trying to create this inclusive environment, not a fabulous working environment that everybody can then fit into, but understanding what the environment is for every individual so that they can really be at their best and to thrive and succeed and love what they do. We have another mantra that's come as you are, do what you love. And it's so true. We really want you to come as you are, everything that you are. And we certainly don't expect perfection from people. What we're really looking for is actually people who will bring difference to the organisation, where we're going to have difference in the way in which we work, the way in which we think, how we interact together. It brings levels of creativity. And really, if that's what we're truly saying as an organisation, we had to really look at how we're operating in order to put the action in place to make that a reality. And so even though we have strong beliefs around, you know, creating this environment for everybody, there were definitely some gaps as we were looking at particularly this early in career community in the UK team, where we didn't really feel we were operating, you know, at our best or for the benefit of everyone. And as everyone's described, you know, we were in a position where we had situations with individuals where we could see that they were struggling, and that could be adapting to a workplace, you know, their first place of work in lots of cases, or with the structure around studying and working together through an apprenticeship. There are a variety of things going on, and we were having like individual interventions in order to help with that. But we took the moment to just step back and say, hold on a minute, is there something different that we could really be doing here for the benefit of all, to be more proactive around the needs of individuals? And as I think Angie called out, the managers play such a key role in this too. And as Ahmed was saying, awareness and understanding for everybody, but then also putting in place the skills, the capabilities, the strategies for a manager as well as for an individual has just been crucial in trying to work this through. And I can't say that this is easy work. I think in a situation where things aren't quite working out, or behaviours are a bit off, or, you know, people aren't turning up to meetings on time, or, you know, people aren't being able to operate with their own level of self-responsibility, the easy answer is to cut and run, quite frankly. But what I love about Microsoft as an organisation is its innate curiosity to understand why something's happening, and that goes to people as well as business and technology and solutions. And if we're really curious about it, you know, we are learning all the time about the benefits that brings to the culture of our organisation, what it really feels like to be here, and then what that really means for our customers and our business, and also the development of the technology that continues to be at the forefront of, you know, the work that we do.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a journey, isn't it? And I think what I was thinking of when you were talking is really that individualized approach, but also the themes. So knowing that if you wait for individuals to struggle and then help them, then you're kind of doing your legal duty. But if you can predict what people are going to struggle with and build it in by design, then you just save everybody a lot of time and money. And also goodwill and relationships. And Ahmed, I was really struck by what you said actually about how you've noticed a change since you've joined, and now that there's more neuro inclusion by design, that's actually reverberating into your kind of awareness is building, and so it's not just those initial cohorts. Carline, I'm really interested in how you got your colleagues to invest in neurodiversity, because, you know, I work with lots of businesses. Every single one of them has at least one person at a senior level who's committed and passionate about this. And then there are blockers. And then there are people who are going, oh no, I need a bit more of an easy life. How can I kind of, you know, I'm not ready for this. What were the winning messages for you? And you were selling this back to your colleagues, like, we need to take this by the horns and be proactive about it. What worked?
Yeah, there are a few things here. So, you know, as you know, Nancy, our partnership with Genius Within started a little while ago. This isn't the first thing that we've worked together on. It was actually the broader HR team within the UK business where we first had a connection. And that really came out of some tricky employee relations cases we had with a couple of neurodivergent employees, where we took the opportunity to spend a lot of time with them understanding what their employee experience was like going through those difficult situations. And as a result of that, we've redesigned our policies and procedures within Microsoft in the UK to ensure that when you know, we have to deal with difficult situations, whether it's around performance or behaviour and seeking improvements, that actually we were designing those with neurodivergent employees in mind rather than neurotypical. And so that was really the start of our journey. And again, there's a desire to create the very best employee experience that we can within this organisation. And so, you know, there's a swell of support, you know, from the beginning. I guess when we started to talk to the early in career team about this and doing something different, and also to the managers within the business, really where we were coming from was to say, like, look at where we are today and the benefit that we're getting from the individual interventions that we were having, but look at the difference that we could make if we were to do something on a broader scale that would actually benefit the onboarding of all early in career employees, that would support managers with, you know, what's a really tough period of investment, actually getting somebody up and running in an organisation. It takes a long time. You have to teach, you have to nurture, you have to support. And if you don't have the right foundation for that in truly understanding the needs of an individual, then, you know, you're up against the task right from the beginning rather than being given a bit of a head start. And so it felt like, quite frankly, it's the right thing to do. And it also makes good business sense to do it as well. You know, we're in the first year of this, so we're still in a place where, you know, we need to determine, what does success really look like here? You know, how do we know that this is working? How can we make it even better than it is today? And that really, it was interesting hearing you talk about the other work you've done earlier around the focus groups, but it has to be about listening and understanding people's experiences so that we can, you know, really evolve and grow this together. So that was the process we went through, really, to get everybody on board.
I think it's interesting that you started with the HR team as a whole. I mean, obviously, I've got experience of working with lots of different businesses, and I think HR is really critical to the success of neuro inclusion by design. I think if you leave HR people out, as you rightly point out, that some employee relations difficulties that might come up when people have got protected conditions are really, that's like your worst day as an HR professional. Those are the things that are really difficult, and people in HR need to know that if something really goes wrong, that's built in, and that's, you can accommodate it within what you're trying to do, rather than, oh, we've got these nice ideas and then when it all goes wrong, we'll send it to you, HR, to pick up the pieces. If we drilled HR in from the beginning, I think that's where things really start to fly. And it's certainly my anecdotal observation as a consultant is that the organisations that start with HR do a lot better than those who don't have HR in the conversations from the start. And that seems to be consistent in my anecdotal experience, but it feels like that's something I should do a study on. I'm kind of designing a study in my mind now as I'm thinking.
The thing I would add to that as well, Nancy, is there's the getting the team on board, but I think more importantly, actually, was the investment we made in the learning for the team, in understanding neurodiversity. And we had a number of workshops together with you and the team, and that's so crucially important. to, again, lay the right foundations. And again, I don't think that work is ever done or complete. It's an ongoing learning journey, but we had to start there to truly understand at a deeper level what we were really talking about here in order to help in the right way.
So do you think that's the right place for businesses to start, is with some really in-depth awareness training where people can kind of really start to think, right, what's going on here, and then formulate a response based on a good understanding of neurodiversity and neurodivergence?
I think so. For the people in the organisation who are going to be the change agents of this, I really do think you have to start there, because you also have to build their knowledge, capability and credibility in this conversation with the business. So I do think you have to invest at that level. You know, when it comes to, you know, the business case here, I mean, I think it's very clear. I think organisations have to look at actually what they're missing out on by not addressing this and not providing you know, different ways of working. It's so easy to have, you know, infrastructure, policies, procedures that solve for the masses, if you like, and allow you to be as productive as you can, as efficient as you can, but actually that isn't always what brings the greatest outcome in terms of business culture, environment. You have to dig a little deeper. You have to invest in a different way. And really, I think starting small is a good place to be, rather than solving for a whole organisation. You know, we were able to start with a couple of things here, and there's no doubt we've seen it in other parts of the Microsoft organisation that then it provides confidence, again, credibility for things then to grow and evolve from there.
Yeah, so if you start somewhere simple, start somewhere straightforward, or start by solving an existing business problem, then that kind of does the selling to other organisational stakeholders all by itself, doesn't it? Because they can see, oh, look what's working. But I'd just like to invite anybody to comment at this point. You know, we've listened to, you've listened to each other's stories. You may or may not have interacted on some of these projects. Is there anything else you'd like to say to employers and employees and potential employees listening to this about being neuro-inclusive by design? Go on, Uzma.
I was just going to see how I could form the answer. I think the common theme that I've just noticed, and it's just an observation I made in terms of the different stages that we've each focused on. Throughout it all, it's just goes back to that sort of bottom line, just knowing when to make a pivot, and just being flexible in our own approach. How many times have we heard that? And now, hopefully, just hearing some of the different insights, it'll be able to add substance in terms of how you can make that pivot and where that creativity needs to be made when you are making those decisions during different stages of the process. Everybody knows, you know, that you want to have every process to be agile in order to sort of really address a problem, but not everybody knows how to make that pivot away from what they're currently doing to trying something new.
Yeah, great theme to notice, a pivot. When we make the pivot from what we're doing, what we've always done because we've always done it, to responding to what's in front of us and shifting direction in response. Any other comments? Angie, I think you had you've got the universal signal of unmuted.
Unmuted. I was just observing that it's when you're sort of saying is that kind of preventative piece, but it's also encouraging people to have the experience of things being difficult. Because what we've described here, we haven't described the emotional, the feeling in the room or in those workshops or in getting this sanctioned. And it's in that the change can happen, because it's very much about navigating through and experiencing things which are challenging so that you can upskill and learn how to navigate through. So I think I just wanted to bring that the work isn't easy, but what's worse is living in an anarchic environment which we don't have the best talent rising through. So it's a kind of, we can't stay static, but just be aware that the work is not for the faint-hearted.
Yeah, and I think Carline, you kind of hinted at that when you kind of discussed starting with some particularly difficult employee relations cases, and instead of sort of blundering through those with the risk averse HR hat on, actually digging into them, which is kind of like the anti-fragility principles, isn't it? You know, which is when something goes wrong, you grow from going through that weakness rather than trying to go around it. You know, how can you learn from what's gone wrong here and digging in and facing those things front on? George, did you want to come in now?
Yeah, I was just going to echo, you know, sort of what Angie was saying, and also what Carline said about it not being easy and straightforward. I think to some extent, you know, in some of our conversations, we've sort of maybe given the impression that, you know, you do step one, then you do step two, and then this is what happens. But in fact, it's so complex, right? So, I mean, I didn't explain perhaps in as much detail as I could have, but that, you know, the workshops I delivered with the early career team, you know, from one workshop to the next, there was this sense of discomfort, kind of, gosh, you know, what are we doing here? How do we do this? How are we going to address the bigger problem now? That, you know, that sort of feeling, as Angie said, you know, feeling that discomfort is actually quite important and part of the learning process. But also even when coming to design or develop the coaching intervention for groups, you know, the what you might have thought was the right thing to deliver at the time will change, and it's okay. It's okay to do that. It's okay, as Uzma was saying, to be flexible. It's okay to pivot, and then it's like, well, this isn't working. Let's do something different. So not to be afraid of experiencing that discomfort and then being, you know, accepting and moving on to something different.
Like it. Does neuro-inclusive by design have a strap line? No pain, no gain. Is it? No pain, no gain. Actually, there's lots of studies that have looked at diverse teams, and you know, what are the differences between diverse teams versus homogenous teams from other forms of diversity, and not just neurodiversity. But the evidence suggests that if you bring together a diverse team, that initial forming stage can take longer and can be more conflicted. So people will need kind of additional time or resource or thought to get through that initial stage. But if you invest in that properly, diverse teams are known to be more productive and more creative in the medium to long term. So it really is short-term pain, long-term gain. Arma, do you want to come in and say anything to finish us off? Because, you know, I think you're kind of living through this and you've got colleagues coming up now. What are you noticing around the culture of Microsoft as this gets more embedded as standard, as opposed to a thing that we might do occasionally?
Yeah, well, I think what's important for employers to start off with is create an environment where it's comfortable for neurodiverse people to express themselves and disclose their disability. Because I think you mentioned previously some employees might have employment trauma from previous employers.
Yeah. Pre-employment trauma, yeah.
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 So they are not maybe they have maybe some trust issues with employers and disclosing their disability. Yeah. And making that environment where it's comfortable for them would be really good, and it helps both the individual and the employer, right? So I think that's quite important. And for new employees starting at Microsoft, creating that culture is good.
And what do you feel, seeing what's happening now with the new apprentices and interns, you know, and how proactive and positive that approach is now? What does that do for you as an existing ND employee?
I realized that I've easily connected with other dyslexic employees. We've created a bit of a community in my department, at least. A few years ago, that wasn't really the case. I didn't even know who else was dyslexic in my department. And then suddenly I realized that one of my teammates have a neurodiversity, and then we create a bit of a community. And I think it's creating that environment where everyone is feeling confident and safe to disclose their neurodiversity.
Wonderful, wonderful. Yeah. And I think the kind of overarching theme here for me is around this transition that we appear to be in as a society, from things being standardized and everyone needing to be the same, to personalization and individuality. And actually that is a tech revolution. That's the tech revolution. That's what it's bringing to our world. You know, we had the industrial revolution where everything had to be the same and kind of, you know, assembly line. And now we've got the tech revolution, and that's really part of what's driving this, I think. So thank you very much for contributing to this talk. If Carline, do you want a last word?
Yeah, throughout the discussion, it's been reminding me of the responsibility that I've always felt over leading early in career teams, that really we are developing the workforce of the future, and the people who are going to lead our, you know, businesses and organisations in the future. And my hope from this work is that we are setting a new bar of expectation around how organisations operate with inclusion by design across the board. And that wherever employees go, whether they stay at Microsoft, stay in the tech sector, move to other organisations, that they take that level of expectation and that learning with them, so that over time we can move, you know, the whole of our organisations, our societies, our industries, you know, in this direction. So I'll end with my dream.
What a wonderful place to end. Thank you very much. Yes, well done. And thank you, everyone. Thanks for watching.